So good-looking and arrogantly male. She had stopped loving him within weeks of their marriage. The first time he had hit her, he had destroyed her image of him, and with it her almost childish adoration. But that did not stop her regretting his death and the waste of such a very young life. Only Gray had stood up for her and said in that quiet, slow voice of his that she was not to blame for Paul's death. But Gray didn't know the truth. Even now he still didn't know the truth, but his defence of her, the way his arms had held her, comforting and protecting her in the shocking aftermath of the news, had formed a bond between them that nothing could ever break. Automatically she turned off the motorway, taking the pretty country road that dipped between the gentle hills and then meandered through the New Forest down to the coast. Her bright yellow VW preferred the gentle pace of country driving, the engine almost purring as the motorway was completely lost from sight and they were swallowed up by golden fields, ripely heavy with their summer crop. Her friends in London teased her about her devotion to her little car. She earned a good living from her work as an illustration artist, and then additionally there was the income she derived from her share in the boatyard that had been in Paul's family for several generations. She always felt uncomfortable about that inheritance, but Gray had urged her not to dispose of it, and she had agreed. Now that Paul's parents were dead, she and Gray were joint owners of the yard. Paul's and Gray's grandfather had started it, passing it on to his two sons. Gray's parents had been killed in a sailing accident when he was 14 years old, and he had virtually been brought up alongside his cousin. But Paul had never really liked Gray. She had known that from the first, and had put the animosity between them down to the 7-year age gap. As a teenager, newly arrived in the area, she had found Gray both distant and rather formidable. It had been her father's interests in boats that had led to her introduction to Paul. The boatyard was one of his accounts at the branch of the bank he had just been transferred to as manager, and he had taken Stephanie with him on a visit to inspect the yard. Paul had been working in the yard, a slim, golden-haired young god with a deep tan and a self-assured smile. She had thought their love was mutual, but she realised now that to Paul she had only been a new challenge. He had a reputation locally as something of a playboy, but she hadn't known that then. She had been a rather shy teenager, a product of an all-girls school, studious and not as knowledgeable about sex as most of her peers. She had just left school and had been looking forward to going to art school after the long summer break, and then she had met Paul. Within days they were virtually inseparable. When Paul discovered her reservations about allowing him to make love to her, and the fact that she was still a virgin, he had announced that they would get married. That had been typical of his impulsiveness and his determination to have his own way. Stephanie had recognised later, but at the time she had been too bemused to do anything but follow where he led. Of course they had encountered massive parental objections from both families, but the more their parents urged them to wait, the more determined Paul became that they would not. Even Gray had suggested that they get to know one another a little better before making such an important commitment. But Paul had laughed at him, she remembered, sneering that since Gray was not married himself, he was not qualified to speak. In the end, their parents had given way, perhaps in the fear that if they did not, they might do something even more reckless. And who knew, perhaps they would have done. Paul had whispered on more than one occasion that if it was the only way, they could start a baby. "Then they'll have to let us get married," he had coaxed. Whether or not she would have gone that far, she didn't know. Certainly she had been bemused enough by her feelings for him to do almost anything he suggested. Her parents had tried to tell her that she was suffering from a classic case of infatuation, but she hadn't wanted to know. She hadn't wanted to believe them. In the end, Paul had got his way. They had had a small family wedding. She had worn a white dress, and they had moved into a pretty cottage down near the harbour that Paul's parents had bought for them. Mr. and Mrs. Chalmers had a large house just outside the village, and Gray lived in what had been his grandfather's cottage quite close to the boatyard. Their honeymoon had been a bitter disappointment for both of them.